Okay, sure. So, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be. My name is Seth Alpert, and I'm at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. And my talk tonight is going to be a little different than some of the didactic talks that the PedsUroFLO has done over the last few months, in the sense that this is not a talk that anyone's ever going to write a test question on, or can appear on the in-service or anything else like that. It's not a clinical talk per se, but going to speak on some history of our specialty, especially as it pertains to how it came to be in the United States. And I thought this talk was interesting in that I was searching for a topic for grand rounds a few years ago, and wanted to do something interesting that I could learn something from. And so I looked into sort of how pediatric urology came to be in this country, and sort of what the early influences were, and some of the history of the subspecialty certification. So next slide here. So I don't have any relevant disclosures for this talk. However, I do have a few disclaimers just to give you some heads up. This talk primarily focuses on the origin of pediatric urology, how it started in the 1950s to basically the early to mid 2000s. And just to give another disclaimer, pediatric urology, since it started as a formal subspecialty around the 1950s, it's fairly new as compared to a lot of the other ones. And much of the history to date is largely male and largely Caucasian. So a lot of the pictures and the people I'm going to talk about are a lot of old white guys, essentially. And so if one gives this talk in maybe 20 or 30 years, I would think that certainly the way our specialty is going, that'll be much different in terms of the participants and the later influences, et cetera, which is it's a great thing as our subspecialty becomes more and more diverse. So the objectives for my talk tonight are to describe the factors which led to the development of pediatric subspecialties in the US in general, and then introduce some of the major contributors and pioneers in pediatric urology in this country, and to an extent in England as well, had major influences on some of the early folks practicing pediatric urology. Talk about how it became a subspecialty beginning in the 1950s or so. And then lastly, to give an overview of the more recent process of formal subspecialty certification within the American Board of Urology. So oftentimes you go to a meeting or hear someone speak, and they'll kind of reference this quote about their career and then what they've had a chance to accomplish. And they'll mention the fact that if I've seen further than it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. And this was Isaac Newton who said this. So this is part of what this talk means. A lot of the things that people are doing nowadays have to do with what people and their predecessors did before them. So these two guys misread that quote, and they said if I'd peed further than it's by standing on the shoulders of my buddy in order to reach the urinal. So if nothing else, it's always good to have a friend that's kind enough to lend a hand or his pair of shoulders so you can reach the high enough on the toilet there. So another quote I think that applies to this talk is from a poet and American author by the name of James Baldwin, who said that know from whence you came. If you know from whence you came, there are absolutely no limitations on where you can go. So just a little background on me and sort of whence I came, as far as my influences and some of the folks who've had a great deal to do with my career. Started out in Washington, D.C. at George Washington University Medical School, where I had a chance to work with and to get to know the first two pediatric urologists that came across my radar, Barry Bellman and Gil Rushton. And then they had an influence on me, not only to go into urology, but to eventually seek training in pediatric urology. And from there, I moved on to Memphis and Le Bonheur at the Children's Hospital there during residency, where I got to work with Butch Noe and Jerry Jerkins and Mark Williams. And then I was fortunate enough to continue my training in fellowship in Chicago to where it was previously Children's Memorial Hospital, but is now the Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago, with some of the greats in pediatric urology, such as Max Mizell, Earl Chang, and Bill Kaplan. And then continue my career as faculty and joined the Nationwide Children's here in Columbus with Rama Gianti and Steve Koff. So obviously, a lot of all males up until this point. My career, as far as who influenced me, et cetera. But over time, that's begun to change. So one of the favorite quotes of Steve Koff was, "In the fields of observation, chance favors only the prepared mind." And so he had this quote on his desk from Louis Pasteur, and that really influenced a lot of his career and a lot of the folks who he trained, and a lot of the discoveries he made in terms of contribution to pediatric urology. So it's interesting if you go back and look at our fellows over the years, starting with Stephen Cannon up in the upper left-hand corner around 2005. For a while, it was mostly male fellows, but somewhere about halfway through, we started getting more female fellows. And I'm proud to say that the last 6 or 7 years, we've had probably 80% females, and that's much the way our specialty is going. All these folks are superstars, and several of them have stayed with us here in Columbus. So this is our group as of last year. This is pre-COVID, so no one's wearing a mask. And, including both of our fellows from last year, 4 males, 4 females. And so we're starting to even out the gender gap in pediatric urology. And then this is a picture from last year, the Ohio State University Department of Urology. And certainly there's lots of different faces in here, and genders and different nationalities, et cetera. But, call your attention to basically up front, where we have Cheryl Lee on the left, who's a chief of the department, and is the first African-American female to head a major urology department in the U.S., and Rama Gianti on the right, who's my friend and colleague over the last nearly 16 years, who basically is another big influence on me. But certainly we're starting to move away from all white guys and looking at having more females, and certainly more persons of color who are in leadership roles and influencing pediatric urology and urology in general. So one of the major texts that I referred to in this talk is this book by Frank Hinman Jr., which I got off of Amazon a few years ago. It cost me about, I don't know, 20, 25 bucks or something at the time. And now I think it's up to like 50 or so last time I checked. So it's a hardcover book that he authored in 1991. It's not a huge page turner in terms of how it's written, but there's a lot of good information in there about the origins of the specialty in the U.S., et cetera, and a lot of the material I got from there. So the introduction of the book is interesting because he talks about to the men who taught themselves pediatric urology in order to teach the rest of us, and to the children upon whom they learned. And then it's especially dedicated to Frank Bicknell, who I'll get into shortly, who's one of the first pediatric urologists in the country from Detroit. And he was one of the founders of the Society for Pediatric Urology. So one of the other kind of major sources that I was able to reference is from Dr. Rush and Dr. Caldemon. They put up a kind of a webinar or a slide deck on this Sbu website, and it's still there if you want to refer to it. The Road to Pediatric Urological Subcertification, the Making of a Specialty. So what's interesting is just this afternoon, about 2 hours ago, the the AAP section of Urology Newsletter just came out. And one of the lead stories in the newsletter is essentially the text that this slide deck is from Dr. Rush and Dr. Caldemon. So when you get a chance to check your email or check the website, you can read some of this stuff that I'll be talking about. And some of it goes in a little bit more detail than I was able to cover in this talk, but it's still a very timely subject. Just this literally the fall newsletter for the AAP section of urology. So some of the historical milestones in pediatric urology. includes the first described basically treatment of a UPJ obstruction was around the time of the Civil War, when they noted that a child who's about 4 had hydronephrosis from what was later determined to be a UPJ. The way they treated it surgically back then was basically with percutaneous drainage, and not sure what had happened to that child, but that's at least sort of pre-pyeloplasty. And the first successful orchiopexy was described in the literature in a 3-year-old boy in 1877 for an undescended testicle. And obviously that's something that's bread and butter for pediatric urology currently. Some of the earliest hypospadias repairs were done in the late 19th century, and then Friedrich Trendelenburg of the well-known head down, head up for the OR bed described repairing bladder exstrophy in 1906, and then posterior urethral valves were discovered to be a cause of hydronephrosis rather in males in 1919, around the time of the First World War. So children's hospitals in the United States only date back to the 1850s or so, and the first one to be opened was the Child's Hospital and Nursery in New York City in 1854, because there was such a high infant mortality rates that some of the leaders in that city decided that they needed a special hospital just for children and infants, and they established that basically in the 1850s, and this later became part of the New York Hospital and Cornell. And then just a year later, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, which obviously still stands and is a huge pediatric center of the United States, opened in 1855. And then about 15 later, Boston Children's Hospital opened as another freestanding children's hospital. Here in Columbus, about 20 years later, our first children's hospital, as it was known at the time, opened in 1892, and initially had 9 beds and eventually grew to 15. And then about 18 years later, they opened a sort of an outpatient clinic, which at that time was unheard of, because you were either in or out of the hospital. You weren't necessarily seen at the hospital for outpatient concerns. And eventually they opened a larger hospital in the 1920s. And in 1931, the first pediatric medical residency opened. So that's grown quite a bit from, a handful of beds now to our hospital tower that's got over 500 pediatric beds, and open for business 2007, replacing some of the parts of the old hospital over the year. So this gentleman is one of the earliest contributors in the United States to urology in general, and also pediatric urology specifically. So if you don't recognize his picture, you often see it in the White Journal, the Journal of Pediatric Journal of Urology, rather. This is Hugh Hampton Young, who's universally known as the father of American urology. He was the chief of what was then known as genitourinary surgery under one of the most famous general surgeons at Hopkins. William Halsted was one of the fathers of general surgery in this country. And he served from 1897 all the way up to 1940. He was the one to found the first urology residency training program at Hopkins. He's also the founder and the original editor of the Journal of Urology. And he was the first one to describe the radical perineal prostatectomy. So as far as pediatric contributions, he was the first one to describe the classification for posterior urethral valves, the 1 through 3 classification that's a little bit outdated, but still is referred to in some of the older literature. He's also known for the Young D's Ledbetter bladder neck repair for exstrophy and epispadias, and he also proposed performing a subtotal bilateral adrenalectomy for congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So some of the folks who he influenced that are relevant are a gentleman by the name of Frederick Foley, which obviously is a person who invented the self-retaining balloon catheter in 1929, but he also was the one to describe the YV pyeloplasty for UPJ obstruction. And then Frank Hinman Sr., who went on to become the chair of urology at UCSF. He's also the father of Frank Jr., on whom this textbook I mentioned earlier was written. And he's the one who described neurogenic bladder, and was the editor of multiple surgical atlases. So that's Dr. Foley in the left-hand corner and Frank Sr. in the right-hand corner. So one big event in the early 1920s that had a major influence on pediatric medical care in the United States was known as the Shepard-Towner Act of 1921. It's also known as the Promotion of the Welfare and Hygiene of Maternity and Infancy Act. Essentially, this was a governmental program to provide social welfare, to provide more funding for maternal and prenatal care, because at that time, the infant mortality rate in the US was nearly 10% of 1,000 births. So almost 80% of expectant mothers received no prenatal care whatsoever. And obviously mortality rates of their infants was quite shockingly high, and was really something that the folks in the government decided that was unacceptable. The issue with that is the American Medical Association, which had been an organization for a while at that point, feared that this would take away some of their power, and they feared that the government would start to intervene more in non-medical provisions of medical services. And here we are 100 years later, and we haven't solved that problem. If anything, it's government's very intrinsically related to medical care in this country, for better for worse. And so at that time, the AMA thought that this law was a socialist threat, and they formally opposed the law's non-renewal when it came up in Congress in 1929. At that time, there was a pediatric section of the AMA, and they felt that this was going against the interests of their patients, the infants and children. And they decided that they wanted this law supported and renewed. And so they broke off in 1930 to form a separate organization that's now known as the American Academy of Pediatrics, or the AAP. And they decided to hold their first national meeting in Atlantic City in 1931. So where pediatric urology becomes a notion is a well-known anecdote when Harry Spence, who is in Dallas at UT Southwestern, and Frank Bicknell, as I mentioned, from Detroit, were at the AUA meeting in 1948, and they shared a cab to the Boston Pops concert to go see a concert there, or show during the AUA meeting for a social event. And during that cab ride, they famously had a discussion amongst the two of them, both of which had an interest in pediatric urology at the time and were dabbling in it. But they felt that a society needed to be formed outside of the general pediatric organization, and that should focus solely on pediatric urology and solely on folks who were had a strong interest. And so that idea languished for a few years, but in 1951, Dr. Bicknell attended a lecture in Detroit by Meredith Campbell, who was reviewing concepts in pediatric urology and some of the things he had learned as a general urologist with an interest in pediatric urology. And the two of them discussed the idea of forming this new group that others had discussed in the past. And they thought that meeting at the AUA as part of a subset of the meeting would be a good idea. And so this would become what is now known as the Society of Pediatric Urology. So the first pediatric meeting, or the Sbu meeting, wasn't called that at the time, but they announced that they would meet in Chicago in 1951 at the AUA conference. And just to tell you how either times have changed or they stayed the same, they decided the best day to meet for the meeting was Sunday, prior to when the AUA meeting actually started on Tuesday, because Mondays were reserved for folks to get out and play golf. So Sunday seemed like the best day to meet, and so they reserved a room at a local hotel, and they put out invitations and advertised it. They thought maybe 25 physicians or so would have an interest in coming to this meeting. And when they actually held the meeting at the Palmer House Hilton in Chicago in 1951, they had a total of 8 attendees. So you can see some of the folks who attended: Meredith Campbell, Harry Spence, Frank Bicknell, and Frank Hinman Jr., amongst others, with several other urologists who were at that point some of the early forefathers of pediatric urology. And of course, Meredith Campbell is known to all of us, who's the one who is the first editor of Campbell's Urology, which still bears his name. And this is the 8th edition. I think they're on the 10th or 11th edition by now, but this was the best screen grab I could find to illustrate this. And then, of course, Frank Hinman Jr. is well known for the Hinman's Atlas of both urologic surgery and pediatric urologic surgery, which both handy references for various cases that residents, fellows, and even attendings refer to for various procedures. So that first meeting program had a total of 3 didactic talks. Dr. Hinman presented on female pseudohermaphrodism. Dr. Barber presented on UPJ obstruction in infancy and childhood. Dr. Bicknell gave a talk on recurrent infections of the GU tract. They decided that this would become a specialty. They'd be in an annual kind of meeting. And so they decided that they were going to form a society and elect Dr. Campbell to be the president and Dr. Bicknell to be the secretary. And they said that the meeting went so well that year, they would meet again at the AUA in Atlantic City in 1952. So for the next 8 or 9 years, basically they had this meeting as, which they called the Pediatric Group, and it wasn't known as a Society of Pediatric Urology just yet. And they would meet at the AUA meeting annually, and the numbers of attendings grew and grew. And finally, in 1960, when they met in Chicago, they decided that it was best to actually meet away from the meeting, from a different venue, not at the convention center where it had been held. And so they actually met at Children's Memorial Hospital. And this started many years of the SBU meeting being basically adjacent somewhere at a hotel, usually, to the main AUA meeting. And that continues today for the most part, because usually the Friday, Saturday part of the meeting is at a nearby hotel that's one of the conference hotels, but not at the convention center. And then the Sunday portion of the plenary session is generally held on site at the convention center with the AUA with other different abstract sessions. So one of the big influences on some of the earlier American pediatric urologists was this urologist from England by the name of David Innes Williams, or later D.I. Williams. And then later on in his career, when he was knighted by the Queen, he became Sir David Innes Williams. So back in 1948, he was just a resident of urology in London, and working at Great Ormond Street. And he wrote that he, as a senior resident, he realized that he had a young boy who was in acute urinary retention from posterior urethral valves. And he realized that his senior attendings really didn't know what they were doing, essentially, that someone else needed to figure this out and teach others. And so he graduated, and in 1951, he co-authored a textbook from England called The Urology of Childhood with Higgins and Nash in the early 50s. And then just a few years out of residency, he was appointed as the head of urology at the large children's hospital in London, Great Ormond Street. And he went on to train folks like Barry O'Donnell and Bob Jeffs, who would go on to long and illustrious careers in pediatric urology. And by the same time, another surgeon who is basically a pediatric surgeon in the UK, Herbie Johnston, began practicing in Liverpool at Alder Hey Hospital. And so they sort of ran parallel tracks both in London and Liverpool, and would have eventually trained many of the early pediatric urologists here in the United States. And so D.I. Williams was known for a lot of things, but he was also had the honor of giving the first named Meredith Campbell lecture at the SBU, which is a tradition that continues today. And usually it's a very well-known figure in the pediatric urology, some related specialty, and is given essentially every year at the meeting. So this is a picture down here in the lower right of Herbie Johnston, and in the upper right is D.I. Williams. So the other major society that we have in pediatric urology is the AAP section of urology, and so that's also credited to the efforts of Frank Bicknell. And as the SBU was sort of up and running, he decided that there needed to be some presence within the American Academy of Pediatrics as well. And just so happened that his brother-in-law that year was the AAP president, and so he had a friendly ear to listen to and to hear him out. And he approached his friend John Latimer, who was at that time in Columbia and was a general urologist with an interest in pediatric urology. He was also the section president for the AUA in New York. And as an interesting side note, John Latimer is a well-known ballistics expert, and one of his other claims to fame is in the early 1960s, after the Kennedy assassination. He was formally approached by the Kennedy family to perform an independent investigation of the Kennedy assassination. So he had many talents, and the group of them decided they would organize the first AAP urology meeting in New York City in 1966. However, at first, the urologists, as well as some of the surgeons within the AAP, opposed this because at that point, there wasn't anybody doing over 50% pediatric procedures, and there was no place for them to have an affiliate membership to create a society. And so eventually they relaxed that requirement and were able to form a subcommittee within the surgical section of the AAP called the Committee on Pediatric Urology. Eventually, they were able to have enough people who were doing enough full-time pediatric urology in 1971 to formally form the section of urology that we know today. And they had the reciprocity to allow all SBU members to join without any review of their qualifications, as long as they were members in good standing of the SBU. And at that time, they set a requirement for at least 75% pediatric practice to maintain membership. Alan Perlmutter from Detroit again, there's a heavy Detroit presence for pediatric urology in the early days. He was elected as the first chairman of the section. And then in 1975, an AAP member, section of urology, first time became an ABU trustee. And that's a tradition that continues today, that at least one of the trustees is elected from the AAP membership to represent pediatric urology interests on the board. And then in 1984, they established what's known as the Pediatric Urology Medal, which is likely the highest honor one can receive from one's peers in pediatric urology, is for lifetime achievement, essentially. And this is a list of the winners of the award going back to 1984. They gave it the award to Harry Spence and D.I. Williams, Douglas Stevens, John Latimer, Herbie Johnston, many of the early pioneers that I've already mentioned. Several of the ones I'll mention in the subsequent slides, but they've continued to award this medal essentially every year, even though we don't have a section of urology meeting every fall, and that's been replaced by the Fall Congress, which is co-sponsored by the AAP. And that's when the AAP medal is awarded each year. So some of the roots in pediatric urology came from our colleagues in pediatric surgery. So William Ladd at Harvard was the first one to establish an independent surgical service for infants and children at Boston Children's. And anyone who's done any pediatric surgery or worked with pediatric surgical issues knows that the Ladd procedure was been described for intestinal malrotation, and that's still used nowadays for this disease process. So Dr. Ladd and others in 1948 were able to found the surgical section of the AAP. They decided to do that within the pediatric society, as opposed to forming it within the American College of Surgeons, and they aligned themselves more with the pediatricians than they did with their fellow surgical colleagues. So that was a big deal at that time. And so this gentleman, I'll put this up for the residents often and ask them if they recognize this person, and most of them don't, which is interesting. This sort of dates me from being a child in the 80s, but this is C. Everett Coop, and so he is a fellow alumnus from my alma mater of Dartmouth, and graduated in 1937. And his fraternity buddies thought that it'd be funny to nickname him Chick Coop, because coop sounded like a chicken coop, and they called him Chicken Coop. And so essentially just the name Chick stuck, and that's how he was known to his friends and colleagues for the remainder of his life. And so he was the surgeon-in-chief at CHOP for nearly 40 years. And then I sort of knew him in my childhood as Ronald Reagan Surgeon General from in the 1980s. And he was big back then and during the AIDS crisis and when HIV was coming out, and basically came out with a lot of public health issues then. But back in the 50s, he was the first individual to request specialty certification in pediatric urology, pediatric surgery rather, from the American Board of Surgery. But the American Board of Medical Specialties denied that and basically said at that point there's no need to have specialty certification. But ultimately, about 12 years later, in the 1967, this was first recognized as a formal subspecialty when it was listed by his name in the American College of Surgeons directory of members. And Chick Coop was also worked very closely with John Duckett for many years at CHOP, and John Duckett was certainly one of the first forefathers of pediatric urology at CHOP, and trained many of the first generation of pediatric urologists here. And so what they learned from that is eventually the American Board of Surgery gave in and basically approved a certification process in pediatric surgery. And they had the first exam to certify pediatric surgeons in 1975. And so the experience gained from the experience of what the pediatric surgery had to go through to gain their sub-certification was really a model for pediatric urology to obtain our specialty certification, which happened eventually in 2008. So Sir Dennis Brown was another pediatric surgeon in the UK, and he's basically recognized as the father of that specialty in England. And his view on basically certification was that pediatric surgery exists as a specialty, not so much to establish a monopoly, but to establish a standard. And that's one of the things that people wanted to express, that it wasn't so much to disallow people from practicing, but to establish a standard by which one who called himself a pediatric surgeon had to meet. And so, of course, Dennis Brown is the one who invented the Dennis Brown retractor that many of us still use for reimplants. And what's interesting in this is that this is one of the few surgical instruments that bears the surgeon's first and last name. So Dennis Brown, I always thought it was a hyphenated name at first, but it's actually his first and last name, as opposed to, say, a DeBakey or an Adsons or some other instrument or device that just has recognizes the surgeon's last name. So Lowell King was a fellow Ohioan, born in Salem, Ohio, up in Northeast Ohio. And he's essentially recognized as the first one in the United States to practice pediatric urology full-time, as opposed to doing some adult and some pediatrics. He finished his urology residency at Hopkins and then was recruited to Children's Memorial in Chicago in the early 60s. He bounced around a little bit for a time and went to a different hospital. And George Kaplan replaced him for about a year, and then George eventually left for San Diego, where he spent the rest of his illustrious career. And Lowell King was well known not only for being one of the first full-time pediatric urologists, but he was an early advocate for antibiotic prophylaxis and non-surgical management of reflux. But that's also accredited to a pediatric nephrologist in England by the name of Gene Smelly. Lowell King recruited both Barry Bellman and F. Douglas Stevens, who was an Australian surgeon, and later described the Fowler-Stevens two-stage orchiopexy. And then Lowell King was one of the first secretaries of the section of urology in the AAP. So one of the early textbooks in pediatric urology was written by Panos Kalalis, Lowell King, and Barry Bellman. And so this is a picture of their second edition. So here in Columbus, one of the forefathers of pediatric urology is a guy named by John P. or J.P. Smith. He started his career at Ohio State in the early 60s and became the chief of the Division of Urology at the what was then known as the Children's Hospital of Columbus. He was a big name in not only the SBU, but on the editorial board of the Journal of Urology, and chaired the section meeting of the North Central section in the mid 60s, which was hosted here in Columbus. And talking to some of the my senior colleagues who were around much earlier than I was, basically they credit him for single-handedly saving pediatric urology in Columbus from being taken over by the pediatric surgeons, and taking all of the genital reconstructions and hypospadias and Wilms tumors basically by claiming them for the pediatric surgeons themselves, and essentially we started a foundation here in his name. And so J.P. Smith is a well-known name here in Columbus as one of the early pediatric urologists. His son, Steve Smith, went on to a career in pediatric urology, and several of his grandsons are also physicians in town. So the first fellowships or training programs in Britain existed there. There were no formal training programs in the U.S. There was some pediatric urology being done in general residencies, but no one to train someone who wanted to be a full-time pediatric urologist. So D.I. Williams at Great Ormond Street, as I mentioned before, and Herbie Johnson at Alder Hey in Liverpool were the first two folks to start to train not only British surgeons, but also expats in the United States. And so some of the names, certainly not all of them, but just a handful of names of folks who trained with these programs, people such as David Bloom, Bill Cromie, John Duckett, Bob Jeffs, Alan Reddick, Howard Snyder, etc. Also John Gearhart, Baltimore. And the interesting about this is that, people on this list, I've been able to work directly with a couple here when I was a resident in Memphis, and then Steve Koff for several years when I first joined the department here. And so this is interesting. These folks went over from anywhere from a few months to a year or more and trained at these British hospitals, and came back and established programs of their own. So some of the first North American pediatric urology fellowships started in the 70s and 80s. And so the ones in bold were the first 6 or so programs in Boston, Chicago, Detroit, CHOP, Mayo and Rochester, and Sick Kids in Toronto. And these were the folks who ran those programs early on. And many of them still exist and are still going strong these days. And then there are others such as Hopkins and Indiana with San Diego, et cetera, who opened later and continue. So there's went from a handful of programs up to about 26 or 27 that we have today. So in order to join these two societies, the AAP and the SBU, they started adding requirements to weed out the folks who were actually doing the majority of pediatric urology. And so in 1997, the AAP had a requirement that one had to complete an ACGME accredited fellowship if one wanted to eventually apply for full membership and fellowship in that society. Now that they had 10 to 15 years of formal training programs open. And in 1998, the SBU followed suit and also added the additional criteria that 90% of practice had to be in pediatric urology. And then once the pediatric in-service exam came out for a short period in the 90s, that one had to participate in that on a routine basis. So some of the other milestones that I had over the years were the fact that the Journal of Urology published their first pediatric supplement in 1986, and that consisted of the abstracts and papers from the section of urology meeting the year before, and eventually they established the pediatric subsection in the Journal of Urology, which still publishes a handful of papers every month. The SFU was founded in 1988 by Max Meisels and several others, and they were the ones accredited for some of the earlier hydronephrosis grading systems, that some of which we still use to some extent today. The pediatric in-service exam was approved in 1995 and started to be given yearly at the same time as the general in-service exam for residents. And that went on for probably about 10 or 11 years until the certificate of added qualification exam came out, and they felt that there was not enough content to run a pediatric in-service exam every year and the CAQ test every year, so they eventually phased out the in-service exam. But the CAQ was at least 20 or 30 years in the making, by many of the organizations and individuals that I mentioned to finally be approved for ABU sub-certification. So they asked the question, what is important about subspecialty certification, and why is this something that's important? And so the three main factors were that they wanted to recognize those who had specific and special training in pediatric urology and were committed to full-time practice. They also wanted to allow parents and pediatricians to recognize those urologists who did have special training, and then allow access to those trained in pediatric urology to those patients and families who at times were denied seeing these specialists by managed care insurance companies. So the CAQ was approved in 2007 and was first offered in 2008. One of the requirements is that the individual has to practice over 75% pediatric urology as they're in their clinical practice. They had to complete a 2-year ACGME fellowship. You first had to be certified by the ABU and pass both the step 1 and step 2 written and oral exams. You had to certify within 6 years of fellowship graduation. You also have to supply them with a 12-month practice log for review to make sure you're doing an adequate number and scope of cases. And it's going to run you about $1,845 to apply. The exam is 125 questions, 4-hour multiple choice. And since it's been offered in the last 12 or so years, the pass rate's about 91 to 100%. And approximately 435 individuals have successfully passed the exam and have been certified in pediatric urology. So this is the group of individuals who essentially wrote the first exam, the pediatric sub-certification exam. That's the required for the certification. Steve DeSimo, Larry Baskin, Mike Ritchie, David Joseph, Tony Caldemon, and Doug Huseman were the ones to put together this test. And there still exists an exam committee today that writes the test every year. So as in conclusion, to wrap up the talk, hopefully I've learned a few things about where pediatric urology came from and some of the places that it will go in the future and how it's changed. But it's evolved as a subspecialty in the U.S., beginning from its early roots in the 1950s and 60s. The two organizations, the Society of Pediatric Urology and the American Academy of Pediatrics section on urology, emerged as the primary subspecialty societies. And the subspecialty certification, the CAQ process, began in 2008 after many, many years of planning and effort by multiple leaders in the field. So just to leave you with a few quotes that I always found interesting and amusing. When Arnold Kolodny, who's a pediatric urologist at Boston, passed away many years ago, they wrote a obituary, kind of a column on him in the Journal of Urology. And at the very end, they credited a few quotes to him that either the whole world is either pre-operative or post-operative. The fact that a patient had surgery doesn't necessarily mean he needed an operation. If you are going to do unnecessary surgery, make sure you do it correctly. Never have the surgeon who did the surgery analyze the results. And probably my personal favorite is, yes, I've seen that complication before, but not personally. So just want to thank you for your time and your attention. This is a picture of my home now, Nationwide Children's Hospital, looking from east to west over the hospital campus, which basically runs a few city blocks here over Livingston Park, and then back toward downtown Columbus in the background, a few miles away toward the state capitol and the downtown building. So certainly, please share any thoughts or questions you have as far as the survey. And if there are any questions or things I can answer, I'd be glad to try to field anything that I know about. So let's see here. So great. Yeah. So just give it a minute, but if there's no questions, I appreciate your time and spending an evening or afternoon here, and hopefully you'll appreciate some of the history of pediatric urology. She continues some of the great work of some of the early pioneers, and feel some connection to them as you understand the roots of the specialty and where it came from. Michelle, do you want to end the recording or end the presentation?
Yeah, we can do that now. Thank you so much for a great presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. That was fun. Definitely.
Yeah,
I really appreciate the opportunity to talk.
Thank you again, and have a wonderful evening.
Okay. Good night.